What are some of dark events happened in history not many people know about? In the early 80s, Bayer knowingly sold millions of dollars worth of HIV and hepatitis-tainted medications to Asia and Latin America. These countries didn't have laws to prevent the proliferation of tainted drugs. Thousands of people died as a result. It was hardly mentioned on any news platforms. Oddly enough, they do not list that particular event in their otherwise fairly detailed history. Disgusting. Once in the 70s, a film crew was filming an episode of The $6 Million Man, and they were shooting at an amusement park funhouse kind of thing. A stagehand was moving what he thought was a prop wax figure on a noose, only for one arm to fall off, revealing human flesh and bone underneath. After an autopsy, it was revealed to be the 60-something-year-old corpse of an old Wild West outlaw that had been taxidermied to an extent. To be specific, it was the corpse of Elmer Mickety, the ULL never take me alive guy. The ideal maternity home here in Canada, from the 1920s till the 1940s. They took in babies from unwed mothers and they were selling them especially to desperate Jewish families in New Jersey. Adoption was illegal in the US back then. It was later discovered that the people who ran this business would starve the unmarketable babies by feeding them only molasses and water. The babies would last around 2 weeks on this diet. They put the corpses in wooden boxes often used for butter, and that's why the victims are called the butterbox babies. The boxes were either buried on the property or at sea or burnt in the home furnace. The parents who gave their child to this maternity home would go back and see how their child is doing, but were told the child has died when in fact it had been sold to adopting parents. Between 400 and 600 died in that home and at least 1,000 were adopted, but sadly, the adopted babies often suffered from diseases because of the unsanitary conditions and lack of care at the home. The Cadaver Synod. Basically, the Pope had a previous Pope's corpse exhumed so the corpse could stand trial for something made up. So they dug up his bloated 7-month-old corpse and convicted him, retroactively nullifying his papacy. Then they dumped his bloated and convicted corpse in the river. The people got pissed and overthrew the Pope, who was strangled in prison. The next Pope came along and had the corpse collected from the river and its papacy posthumously reinstated. 897 was a crazy year. The San Francisco Plague of 1900-1904 was a terrible, scary time when the Black Plague was beginning to ravage San Francisco. California's governor tried to suppress information about the outbreak and restrict any activities to curtail it because he feared economic damage to the state. He even tried to get the doctor who was warning people about the outbreak fired. What information did get out was used against the Chinese residents, as it was believed that it was a disease of the unclean. Had it not been for the earthquake in 1906 that devastated the city, the plague outbreak would have probably been more remembered. During Prohibition, the government funded and led an operation to release barrels of alcohol that they had poisoned to make people sick and shy away from bootleg liquor. Lots of people ended up dying, but people still drank more than ever. Highly recommend the book The Poisoner's Handbook for more information on this and other interesting Prohibition-era chemistry escapades. The Halifax Explosion. Regarded by many as the biggest man-made explosion prior to the invention of the atomic bomb. A ship laden with explosives collided with another vessel in Halifax Harbour. The resulting explosion flattened much of the city's downtown core, killing roughly 2,000 and injuring 9,000. The blast is said to have temporarily displaced the water in the harbour, forming a tsunami that's reached up to 15 meters high, surging over the wreckage of the waterfront. The following day, Halifax was hit by a blizzard that dumped 40 centimeters of snow on top of the city, further complicating rescue efforts. The city is also home to a cemetery where many victims of the Titanic were laid to rest. It is said that the body identification system developed at the time of the Titanic's sinking in 1912 aided efforts to identify victims of the Halifax explosion in 1917. There is a surprising amount of people that do not know about the Rwanda genocide that happened pretty recently, like when Bill Clinton was president. But basically there were two types of Rwanda natives, the Hutus and Tutsis. The Hutus believed the Tutsis were invaders of land that was theirs. And after the assassination of the Rwandan leader who was a Hutu, the Hutus were ordered to chop down the tall trees, which meant kill the Tutsis. The differences between Hutus and Tutsis were that Hutus were supposedly darker skinned, shorter in stature, and had shorter faces. That is why the Tutsis were called tall trees. The events that followed killed so many Tutsis. Yet the UN was stingy to call it a genocide. It wasn't until very recently that the killings stopped. To this day, Hutus and Tutsis that survived the genocide speak at events side by side, speaking about how terrible the events were. It gets worse when you hear about the churches. The Hutus told the Tutsis that they would be safe in a church, then went to the churches to murder them all. There was so many they had to take shifts because they couldn't kill all the Tutsis before getting too tight. It gets worse though. Pregnant women would get cut open, and any kid born or unborn that was small would get picked up and slammed against a wall until they died. I don't know if this was Rwanda or somewhere else. But they also took girls from schools, and when their family went to pick them up they would light the girls on fire to see who their parents were and then kill them all. In my family's region in Africa, they used to carry out the death penalty by snakebite. Just a snakebite to each ankle, and then letting the man spend his remaining time with his family before he died under supervision. I thought it sounded sort of humane in a way, like our lethal injections. But apparently they say it was one of the most horrific ways that existed. The most horrific part is that your family watches this death. Letting the man spend his remaining time with his family here really means making him die a slow, agonizing death in front of his family. The sad case of Otabenga. He was a pygmy boy from the Congo who was essentially captured and brought to the USA to be displayed in freak shows. He had undergone tribal customs such as having his teeth filed into points before his capture. He eventually got out of the carnivals and dreamed of returning to Africa. Then World War I happened, making the trip impossible for the foreseeable future. He committed suicide by gunshot. Not only was he in a freak show, but he was also put in the zoo, sharing an enclosure with apes. The Radium Girls. In the 1920s, they worked at a watch company painting the hours on the watches using radium, a radioactive element that glows in the dark. They did this with no PPE and weren't told radium is dangerous. Meanwhile, the chemists had full PPE and worked in a sealed environment. Worse, they were instructed to lick the tip of the brush to make a very fine point. Some of them would paint their nails or their teeth with it for fun when they went out at night. They would develop cancer whenever the paint touched, and many of them had such decay in their jaws that their mandibles had to be held on with bandages. The Massacre of Kolavrita. It is a village's Greece. The Germans entered it and rounded up all the male villagers in a field. They then shot them all with machine guns. After that they got the children and women and put them in the church. When everyone was inside, they locked the doors and set fire to the church. Around 20 minutes into the burning, a German soldier couldn't take it anymore and opened the doors. Around half of the people escaped the fire, but the rest perished. The German soldier was shot for this, and if you go to Kolavrita today his name is on the memorial. No one was punished for this apart from the leader of the division, who I was told by my grandmother that he died in a gulag. But everyone else got away with it. It is sad that no one knows about this, as things like this happened all over Greece and Russia and Poland. I only know about this because my great-grandmother was one who escaped in the church. This massacre was in retaliation for the villagers supporting the local resistance force, which had recently killed about 10 Nazis. Kuk Kai, or the Chicken Poot prison in Thailand, used by French forces to hold political prisoners, rebellious-type people in the Chanthaburi region. The long-standing impacts of this much-feared torture are still felt in the region today. There is a Thai saying for those who buck authority that roughly translates to be careful not to get caught in a chicken poot prison. I learned about this prison from my parents who learned about it from theirs. How it worked was there was a small, 2-story prison. Bottom floor houses the prisoners, and the top floor is basically a huge chicken coop. The grated floor ceiling ensures that the chicken poop falls onto the prisoners below. Apparently, even though the maximum sentence in Kuk Kai was around a week, it was one of the most feared punishments there was. Use of the Judas cradle for torture. The Judas cradle was a pyramid-shaped seat set up high where the victim would be seated on the pinnacle. While tied, the pyramid point would penetrate the victim's anus or vagina, and the sheer weight and movement of the person would slowly help it penetrate more. The torturer would sometimes add weight to the victim's legs, rock them, or add oil to the pyramid to increase the pain and quicken death. There was a lesser, similar punishment called riding the wooden horse, which was extremely common in early America, up until the Civil War. I even remember seeing it referenced in some founding fathers' letters. Once the predominant punishment for theft crimes especially, you just make the person straddle a wooden ledge, often part of a bigger structure, to look like a horse, and can put weights on their feet, so the wedge will cut into their inner thighs over time. Magdalene asylums, also known as Magdalene laundries, places of reform for women that didn't fit the idea of a good upstanding citizen. The most well-known ones were in Ireland. The women and girls were abused and mistreated by asylum staff, most of whom were nuns. Also, just to add to that, the recent scandal of the mother and baby homes. Absolutely horrific. Heard about it on NPR. Mass graves of hundreds to thousands of bodies, many of them tiny children, covered up by the church. All mothers and children born out of wedlock. Croatia S. Ustachas. Sick radical mythificas. An Ustacha that isn't able to take out a baby from its mother's womb with a blade. Isn't a good Ustacha. Anti-Pavelic. Some of their most horrific crimes were burning babies in front of their parents, mangling kids from 0-14 with axes, raping girls in front of their mothers, cutting off the ears and noses of their prisoners while being alive. Even the Nazis were horrified by these guys' methods. Highland Clearances. Thousands of Scots were forcibly evicted from their homes. Many were forcibly exported to Canada, the US or Australia. Many who refused were massacred, with whole villages of women and children raped. Many died of starvation on the forced marches or from famine. Also, they could farm sheep. His name was Patrick Seller. Saying this because I just read through the wiki page of some basketball player looking for his atrocities against the Scots. One that really stands out to me is of the Filipino zoo girl that was on display in the Coney Island Zoo in 1914. She was bound by ropes and people tossed peanuts at her. It's just heartbreaking to see something like that happen, especially to a child so young. Many people have no idea that human zoos existed, but they are definitely a dark part of history. What is crazy is that there have still been some that have popped up in the 21st century, although not as cruel as they used to be. The Cambodian Genocide. You could have been killed just for wearing glasses. Therefore, being an intellectual, at least this was the Khmer Rouge logic. The prisoners were tortured so badly that they tried to commit suicide in every possible way, even by using some spoons. The executions used to be like this. The prisoners were put on a straight line until the second prisoner was given an object like a shovel or a hammer, which he had to use to kill the prisoner in front of him. Then, the same object was given to the third prisoners, and the cycle would repeat until there was nobody alive except for the last prisoner on the line, who was then killed by the guards. Since many medics were killed or sent to work as farmers, the local regime used child medics to conduct experiments on the prisoners. They used teenagers with no knowledge of Western medicine to experiment on people without anesthesia. For example, they opened one person's chest just to see his heart beating. Madame Lalaurie, slave owner who tortured her slaves in horrifying ways. Evil poop. Didn't a whole season of American Horror Story revolve around her? The January 1945 sinking of the MV Wilhelm Gustloff. It was a German ship carrying fleeing Germans from the Eastern Front to the west through the Baltic Sea. It was sunk by the Soviet Navy shortly after setting sail. The total death toll is unknown, but estimated at over 9,000 since there were so many stowaways. It is the worst maritime disaster ever, several times more than the Titanic. It didn't get nearly the press because they were the enemy, so who cares? And the Nazi media certainly didn't report it because they were at the waning days of a war they were badly losing, so the last thing they need is more hits to their already sinking morale. Overall, I think it's not really taught how the Germans were actively fleeing the Soviet advance and trying to surrender to the Western Allies.